Well, we haven't done one of these cheesy old horror movies in a while, so why not? Let's talk about a crappy old Roger Corman horror movie from the 60s.
Come in. I surprised her in her room. She was not alone. With my own hands, I killed her.
Starring Boris Karloff.
Take this gun. Escort this gentleman from the castle. If he resists, kill him.
The Terror. Join Boris Karloff, the Frankenstein monster of all horror motion pictures, in his most blood-chilling screen experience.
Haven't done a bad movie like this since last year with The Screaming Skull. A French army officer has been separated from his unit and receives help from a mysterious woman. He follows her to the castle of Baron von Lepp, only to find that she is the Baron's wife, who died 20 years ago. Perfectly even, 5 out of 10 on IMDb, and even though this is from schlock master Roger Corman, you'd actually be surprised how decent the cast is in this, because not only do you have Boris Karloff, but you also have a very young Jack Nicholson. If you've kept up with these Blockbuster show videos, or just bad movies in general, you probably know about the man, the myth, the legend himself, Roger Corman. He was a very smart businessman when it came to producing bad movies. He worked very cheap, very quick, and very efficient. He had connections to some legendary actors, like, in this case, Boris Karloff, and in other movies, Bela Lugosi. But it was usually around the time that their careers were kind of on the downward slope. He was usually a stickler for reusing footage in his movies, and this movie is no exception. There's tons of footage, and even the set in the movie, the main set, is the exact same set that they used when they were making The Raven, because this was also around the time Roger Corman was going through his phase where he was making movies based on Edgar Allan Poe stories. Surprisingly, this actually isn't an Edgar Allan Poe story. This was an original work, and this was typical for Roger Corman. Usually, he would try to film certain scenes first, and then he would try to go backwards and work around it, and it really shows with this one. Even though Roger Corman is credited as the main source behind this movie, this actually isn't just his film. Various different directors that he knew also worked on the thing. Apparently, even a very young Francis Ford Coppola worked on this movie, which is surprising to think. You go from The Terror to the Godfather movies. Aside from Boris Karloff, we also have a very, very young Jack Nicholson, who not only stars in the film, but allegedly directed certain scenes of it as well. So what exactly is this movie about? Well, shit, I don't know. That's the best way to start. There actually is a plot. Very loosely, I call it a plot, because much like bad, cheesy horror movies from the 50s and 60s, this movie is ungodly boring, just like Screaming Skull and Manos the Hands of Fate and other cheesy horror B flicks from around that time, like The Giant Claw and Creature with the Atom Brain and other black and white shitfests like those. This movie is a bunch of people either just wandering around or talking, and it doesn't start to pick up the pace until like the last act of the movie. You have a French soldier, played by Jack Nicholson, and it's one of those movies where, despite being a French soldier, and this takes place in like the 18th century, so like lots of old castles, no technology, it's a period piece, it's that kind of movie. And there were a lot of these kind of movies made back then, obviously. But he's supposed to be a French soldier, and he doesn't have a French accent, so take that for what it's worth. But he wanders into this area, after being separated from his troops and his men. And he comes across this castle that has a baron living in it, and the baron is played by Boris Karloff. Jack Nicholson's character suspects him of something because he says that his wife is dead, and he suspects that she might be a ghost and that she's wandering around and that she still speaks to him.
Has anyone else except yourself seen the spirit? Stefan, for instance.
You think I'm mad, don't you?
Right now, Baron, I'm not sure just what I think.
But don't forget, you saw her too.
At first, Jack Nicholson thinks he's crazy, but then he starts to see this girl wandering around the grounds as well, and he starts to fall for her, but he doesn't really think she's a ghost, but then he starts to think that she's a ghost. And you introduce this old witch character who lives out in the woods in a shack somewhere, and then they reveal halfway through the movie, like right around the midway point, they reveal that this girl is working with the witch, or I guess working for, because the witch sits her down and puts her in front of this like multicolored spinning thing that I guess hypnotized the girl, and so they think that the witch cast some kind of spell on the girl, and then they start to reveal her plans.
Oh, powers of darkness, let the spirit of Ilsa sink deeper, deeper into this mortal form. Helene, be as though you never were.
By they, I mean Jack Nicholson and butler, assistant, guy that helps around the Baron's castle, played by Roger Corman regular Dick Miller, the late great Dick Miller. Obviously, he was Mr. Futterman in the Gremlins movies, and he appeared in another Corman production. He was the slimy business guy in Evil Toons. So, yeah, very young Dick Miller. Good to see that, you know, even in his young age, he was still working with Coreman, and we can only assume later down the line he then started collaborating with Joe Dante regularly. But in this movie, he works for the Baron, and he often goes to a lot of the same places that Jack Nicholson is going to. He's trying to figure out what's going on like Jack Nicholson is, and when I say they're trying to figure out what's going on, there are several scenes of people wandering around the castle and opening doors, not going into them, and then wandering down the hall some more. Several scenes of people just wandering around and, you know, talking to this girl when they think that she's just a regular person, or they start suspecting that she might be crazy or that she might be a ghost.
My name is Helene. The old woman told me.
She lies.
She summoned me from the sea.
You must go back. Your soul is troubled, Ilsa.
There are a lot of scenes like this, and that's what I meant when I said the movie was boring earlier, because the first 2/3 of this movie are nothing but this. The movie's credit, there are a few scenes where it seems like they're trying to build suspense. I mean, this is what a lot of old horror movies from around this time were trying to rely on more. Nowadays, in crappy horror movies and shows and games, they either rely on gratuitous violence and gore or crappy-ass jump scares. So back then, there was more of an attempt to try and build suspense, but just like the Screaming Skull, there's just way too many scenes of people just wandering around and the music just kind of... Another thing that weighs that down is, I get it, it was 1963, color in movies was still fairly new, but this movie is so dark and so murky, you can barely make out what the hell is happening on screen. Now, one thing that is good is that there's various different versions of this movie, and I did eventually find one that actually had more cleared up color, and I can assume that this was from some recent re-release on Blu-ray, possibly, but when I started watching the movie, the version that I had the worst color. It just was so dark, you could barely make out what was happening. Hey, it doesn't really matter since most of what was happening was nothing. It's just people wandering the woods late at night, which is already pitch black, so you can barely see what's going on. And then people wandering around a dark castle as the music swells, and they're trying to build suspense, but it's just, at the end of the day, a young Jack Nicholson opening doors and then closing them and then moving over to the next door, opening it, not going in the room. Every time scenes like this popped up with Jack Nicholson wandering around the castle grounds, part of me was just thinking, wow, they would eventually get this right many years later with Jack Nicholson in The Shining.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Stay away from me!
Wendy,
Stay away!
darling, light of my life. I'm not gonna hurt you. You didn't let me finish my sentence. I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains in. I'm gonna bash them right the fuck in.
Stay away from me! Don't hurt me!
I'm not gonna hurt you.
And as for Boris Karloff, it's very apparent that they filmed his scenes in just 2 days. I mean, he barely does anything to the main plot. I mean, it does revolve around his character and things that he supposedly did or had done. He's obviously a very crucial character, and, you know, obviously when they were making this movie, he was the main selling point. He's on the poster, he's in the trailers, because they didn't know Jack Nicholson was going to become a name. Jack Nicholson was still just a young up-and-comer at the time, so really the only person they could advertise was Boris Karloff. And
in the name of the government of France, I order you to open this door.
Your pardon, young sir. I was at my devotions. I did not hear you.
Man was a legend in horror cinema, so I can see why they would try to market the movie with him as the main selling point. And even though his career was starting to go on the downward at this point, he still had a couple of things. I mean, Targets, which is a really good movie, and that was something he was apparently trying to work on and build to, and rightfully so. That movie was really well made. And, you know, he did the narration for How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was a couple of years after this, so there's that. It's a Christmas classic. But, I mean, the man was getting old. Several scenes where he's supposed to be physically aggressive, it doesn't really work, because the man was old at that point. Though there are some pretty decent stunt scenes. I mean, there's a scene where he's getting swept away in large bodies of water. It's like, shit, it's pretty impressive for the time. This movie has a bunch of nothing going on in the first 2/3. There are things that happen, like, for example, there's a hawk that keeps showing up, and at one point it attacks this one guy who, like, kind of wanders around. I forget if he was in cahoots with the witch or the Baron, I don't remember, but this guy's wandering around, and he ends up getting attacked by the hawk, and the hawk scratches his eyes out. Funny enough, also happened in another movie that was released that year. It was a little movie, I don't know if that many people had heard of it. It's a little independent film. It was called Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. It showed the guy getting his eyes pecked out, and I mean, even though this was the 60s, like, we were kind of building up to, you know, the proto-slashers and then the big slasher films of the late 70s and the 80s, but pretty decent gore effects, I gotta say, all things considered. Roger Corman was good at elements like that. The man was really good at, you know, cheap blood effects for movies, so there was that. And there's a stunt that's actually not bad, where the guy goes falling down a hill, and that's Dick Miller sees him. It's obviously a dummy, but you know what? As a person who likes practical effects, I give him kudos. For 1963, it didn't look that bad. Every time they kept showing that hawk, and it has this, like, terrible screech sound effect, like, ah, 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 it immediately made my brain go back to Birdemic, even though Birdemic was long after this movie. I would love to see an edit of this movie where they take the thing of the guy getting his eyes pecked out and just add it into the scenes in Birdemic where they do the same thing. This movie really could have used long-haired hippie man talking about spruce bark beetles and Doctor on Bridge talking about global warming. Here's where we have to wrap it all back, because in the third act, they finally start to reveal what the hell is happening with really rushed expository dialogue. So as for what the main characters and the audience are supposed to think is going on, the witch is supposedly hypnotizing this girl into thinking that she's the ghost of the Baron's wife, and the witch is sending her to try and convince Boris Karloff to kill himself because the witch wants to get revenge on Boris Karloff because she thinks that he killed her son, so she's doing all of this as a sick, twisted act of revenge.
To avenge myself on the Baron von Lepp. She will drive him to God's one unpardonable sin, suicide.
For what offense? What has the Baron done to you?
He killed my son, Eric.
Eric was your son?
Yes. And tonight the Baron pays for Eric's life with his own immortal soul.
I'm not kidding, they rushed that exposition like crazy. And they don't stop there, because then it's revealed that Dick Miller killed her son by accident, and just as she's about ready to strangle him, he then reveals that the ghost of her son is now possessing Boris Karloff, or Boris Karloff was her son the whole time. That they are not specific about that.
She thinks it was the Baron that killed her son. She never knew it was you.
What do you mean? He killed my Eric.
Eric is her son?
You murderer!
No, wait! The Baron did return that night to find Eric with the Baroness, and he did kill her. But there was a struggle, and in the fight, it was not Eric who died, but the Baron. I killed the Baron.
Then Eric is still alive?
He took the Baron's place, and for 20 years, no one has known. But he took the Baron's place in mind as well as body. In his mind, he is the Baron von Lepp.
And that's the problem with this movie. Maybe this would mean a little bit more if it was hinted earlier on, or if you were trying to like lay some breadcrumbs as a way to set up that this twist was coming. As it stands, it just comes right out of nowhere. You can really tell that they were just rushing this thing together. So now the witch doesn't want Boris Karloff to die. Boris Karloff and the girl who is hypnotized into thinking that she's the ghost of his wife, they have a struggle for a little bit. The castle ends up filling up with water, and they all end up getting swept away. The old woman tries to fight Jack Nicholson because he thinks that what she's doing is wrong. So they have a scuffle for a bit, but then she gets struck by lightning with some really laughably bad special effects. So fucking boring and dull that even when things started to pick up steam in the last 10 minutes, I still don't know what the fuck happened. Dick Miller's character dies, and then I believe Boris Karloff's character dies. It ultimately comes down to the girl and Jack Nicholson, and Jack Nicholson tries to talk to her as if like, you know, oh, it's just the two of us now we can be together. But then, not one, not two, but three plot twists, baby. It turns out that she actually wasn't hypnotized into working with the witch. It turns out that she was summoned by the witch, and that she's actually a shape-shifting demon from hell. And she's apparently so weak now, after she kisses Jack Nicholson, she then melts into a skeleton, and that's like the final shot of the movie. And the funny thing is, the movie begins with what we can only assume is that same skeleton. So, was that her, or was that the skeleton of his actual dead wife? Like, we don't know. We can only assume, because this movie, if it's not explaining things blatantly, leaves it to imagination, so to say. overall, yeah, this is a very bad movie. You can tell that they rushed it, despite some good acting here and there and some kind of impressive practical effects. And even the sets, like the set that they use in The Raven, it's a good set. I can see why they would reuse it. Roger Corman was well known for reusing stuff like that, whether it was sets or props or footage. Like there's several times where they reuse footage from other Corman movies. Like this, several scenes of the outside from the castle. I'm more than positive that was used in other films that he did. But really, the biggest problem with this movie is the same with a lot of other bad horror movies and B movies from around this time. It's boring. It's very boring. Lots of scenes of people just wandering around. I mean, other than that, I mean, if you have a tolerance for bad movies, or if you're into film and you kind of want to see, you know, the evolution of bad movies, or like if you're studying the filmography of Roger Corman, this is an interesting one because, yeah, this was at a time where Roger Corman wasn't doing cheesy, low-budget horror movies. He was mostly doing adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories. So the fact that this one isn't one of those, and it's just kind of slapped in between those movies, makes it kind of interesting. And this was long before he started experimenting with the cheap, low-budget, straight-to-video horror movies and, you know, kind of horror comedies in the late 80s, early 90s. And then he tried dabbling with family movies with stuff like Skateboard Kid and later Flying Ryan and stuff like that. So it is interesting to see a movie kind of like this, and to its credit, it's not as tedious as something like The Screaming Skull or Manos: The Hands of Fate, just because you have some legitimate star power in here, because you got Jack Nicholson and Boris Karloff. But other than that, yeah, this movie, I obviously wouldn't recommend this for everyday people. I mean, maybe your parents who are into older movies, like if they're looking for something new, it's available on YouTube, maybe then, but yeah, I really couldn't recommend this. I put it like this: if you're a regular with bad movies and you have seen your fair share of low-budget 50s and 60s horror movies, you know, stuff like this, or if you're a regular fan of something like Mystery Science Theater, then yes, by all means, this movie is pretty much in the same league as a lot of the movies that they've talked about. It's definitely in that vein of those old cheesy movies that they would talk about. In fact, it's kind of surprising that they didn't do it, because the people who own the rights to this movie, because it's public domain, it's the same people that owned Screaming Skull, so I'm kind of surprised that they never did one. Unless they did a riff tracks or something years later, but I'm not too sure at the moment. But anyways, guys, tune in next time. We're going to be doing a video from a convention. I'm going to be going to RetroCon on Saturday. So if anybody wants to see me, I'll be wearing the Blockbusters uniform. I'll be carrying a Blockbusters videotape or something similar. Be pretty easy to spot. But just in case, I'll try to advertise it a little bit more. You know, it'll probably be posted on like the Facebook page or in the community tab, something. Yeah, that's what to expect next time for Blockbuster Show. Until then, guys, I'm Adam Sykes of the Blockbuster Show, and we will see you guys in the next video.
Where did you find the girl?
Is no girl.